This is a 1990 Bentley Turbo R, and it was the ultimate Bentley back when it was being made. If you were rich back in 1990, you bought a Bentley Turbo R. This car cost $200,000 back then, which translates to about $380,000 today. And today I'm going to show you what you got when you bought the ultimate Bentley 30 years ago. I've borrowed this Turbo R from WS Auto Sales, which is located here in the San Diego area. WS has some incredibly interesting cars. For instance, this looks like a normal 6 Series, but on closer inspection, well, no it isn't. Oh, and that BMW X3 in the background was also a manual. If you want a rare, quirky, cheap car, WS Auto Sales is a good place to find it. You can check them out with the link in the description below. So let me give you a little Turbo R overview. This car was the ultimate Bentley back in the day. The modern equivalent would be the Mulsanne, the top of the Bentley lineup. The Turbo R came out in the mid-1980s and it was sold all the way through 1999 when it was finally replaced by the Arnage. Now, when this car was new, Bentley also sold a base model of the Turbo R. It was called the Mulsanne originally, and then later the Brooklyns, but they were slow. The Turbo R was the one to have. It had a 6.75 liter turbocharged V8 that made about 300 horsepower and about 450 pound-feet of torque. Amazingly, this car uses a General Motors 3-speed automatic transmission. Bentley didn't swap it out for a 4-speed until 1992. These days, you can pick up a Turbo R cheap. As I film this video, there are 4 listed for sale on AutoTrader. All are under $30,000. But that's typical of what happens as Bentley and Rolls-Royce models get older and they become more expensive and more difficult to maintain. But anyway, today I'm going to take you on a tour of the Turbo R and show you around the ultimate Bentley of its day. First, I'm going to show you all of the interesting quirks and features of the former Flagship Bentley, and then I'm going to get it out on the road and drive it, and then I'm going to give it a Doug score. And for more of my thoughts on the Turbo R, click the link below to visit autotrader.com/oversteer. All right, I'm going to start the quirks and features of the Turbo R with getting in, and that means talking about this key fob. You can see this car has a remote, which would have been unheard of in 1990, but you press this large button at the top and it locks and unlocks the doors and it works perfectly. I'm not sure if this is factory or aftermarket, but I assume it's aftermarket. It was a common thing in the 90s to get an aftermarket remote system to lock and unlock your doors. But either way, this car has it, and that's how you unlock the doors. And now that we've got the door open, the interesting quirks really start coming. I'm going to start with this little plaque in the door jamb. You can see it says Bentley Motors. It's very high quality, almost looks silver. No purpose for it other than to make you feel special. But that's a preview of all the luxury to come. And next up, a good example of that luxury is on the door panel. You can see there's lots of leather and wood trim. My very favorite trim on the door panel, though, is the wood on the top. You can see you have wood trim, and then around it, there's a different kind of wood trim. So this car is so luxurious that it has wood trim on wood trim. That's how you know you're in a serious luxury car. Also on the door panel, you have another one of my favorites. That would be 4 unlabeled switches. These are your window switches, of course. The one closest to you, that's the driver's window. The other ones, I don't really know. Some labels would be nice. And next up, we move on to the inside of the Turbo R. And the very first thing you notice in here is that there is leather and wood everywhere. On every surface, everything is either leather or wood, all nicely stitched and placed together. This car came from an era where luxury meant high quality materials and craftsmanship, and not how much technology you could cram into a car. For a good example of just how far Bentley took the leather and wood in this interior, take a look at the sun visor, which is this beautiful leather. Many modern luxury cars don't bother making the sun visor leather since since it's not used all that often, but in this car, they spared no expense. The crazy part is you drop the sun visor and the mirror cover is wood. They didn't even go with plastic for that. Even that little piece is wood. But you'll notice when you open the sun visor mirror that the mirror light isn't turning on. So what's the deal? Is it broken? Oh no, that's another interesting quirk of the Turbo R. To activate that light, there's a little switch in the center console that says mirror. You press that and then the light turns on, and that's how you turn on your sun visor mirror in the Turbo R. Now, amazingly, that switch to turn on the mirror lights is not the craziest switch in this center console area. That honor goes to this little button with horn graphics on it. What exactly does that do? Well, this car has a dual note horn. Let me show you what I mean. Activate the horn and it sounds like this. But if you press that button in the center console and then you activate the horn, it sounds like this. In other words, this car gives you the option of which horn sound you want. I was always told this was called a town and country horn. You have one louder horn for the country, for longer distances, and one quieter horn for when you're in town. Very unusual by modern standards. And speaking of that horn button in the center console, another interesting horn-related item is how you activate the horn at all. You have buttons on the steering wheel, and not just one or two of them, but rather four. You have 2 buttons at the top, and then 2 more buttons at the bottom. So basically every spoke of this steering wheel allowed you to turn on the horn. I guess this car is perfect for drivers with road rage. But back to the center console and back to those switches you use to turn on your sun visor mirror lights. If you look at the switch over on the driver's side, you can see the lower half says mirror, but the upper half says roof. So what exactly is that? Well, if you push it, it will turn on your interior ambient lighting that's mounted on the ceiling. Not on the roof, as Bentley says, but rather on the ceiling when you push that switch. Over on the passenger side, on the bottom it says mirror, on the top it says map. If you push map, then that will turn on the front map lights. They're in the same housing as the roof lights, but you can see they're more focused and kind of pointed into your lap if you're in the front seat, which will help you read a map. And next up, we're still not done in this quirky center control area because we gotta talk climate controls, which are wild. Okay, you look in the center area, you see you have these 2 blue discs. Well, these are actually dials. One is for the upper temperature, the air that comes out on the dashboard, and one is for the lower temperature, the air that comes out at your feet. You move these dials and you can see they move from blue to white to red. That's the air temperature. Blue is cold air, white is middle, and then red is hot air. And whatever you want the air temperature to be at, you just move the dial to your desired setting. Very strange. And next up, moving down from all those unusual center controls, you can see there are 2 unlabeled chrome switches next to the cigarette lighter, one on the left and one on the right. So what are those? That's the power mirror controls. You move this little switch on the left and the driver's side mirror moves accordingly. You move the switch on the right and the passenger side mirror moves accordingly. Every other car, there's just one control and you switch between left and right. This car has individual mirror controls because that is luxury. And next up, here's another rather unusual quirk in the center. You can see there are a few gauges in the middle of the dashboard, and one of them is the fuel gauge. But if you look closely at the fuel gauge, you'll see it says min oil on it. So why does the fuel gauge have an oil level mark? Well, it turns out if you press this little oil lamp button in the center console, then for just a brief moment, the fuel gauge will display your oil level. If you let off this button, then it goes back to being a fuel gauge, but that's how you can also check your oil. The fuel gauge will temporarily double as an oil gauge. Very unusual. And next up in the interior is the heated seats. In most cars, there's just a button with a picture of a seat on it and some lines indicating heat. In this, there's an entire control panel that says seat heaters, to explain what it is, and then you can turn it from 1 to off to 2 using these switches on the driver and passenger side. Total overkill, but heated seats was a new thing, and so maybe they felt they had to explain it a little bit more. By the way, next to those heated seats, take a look at the seat memory. You can see there are 4 different memory settings for both driver and passenger seats. Another example of a true luxury item. Also another item worth noting in this center area are the armrests. You had individual armrests for driver and passenger. So you didn't have to fight over whether you wanted the armrest down or not. You could each choose. Now under the armrest, there's this keyhole, and if you try to pull it down, you can see that this is like a roll top storage cover, finished in leather, of course, and underneath that you have a little storage compartment, which is nice, and you can lock it, so it provides extra locking interior storage. Of course, that center storage area is extra locking storage because in this car you also have the glove box, which opens so gracefully. You just push this chrome latch and then the lid kind of drops down ever so nicely, and you can see this is your Bentley glove box. Now also in the glove box you have the owner's manual, which comes in this beautiful leather pouch that has the Bentley B on it. You open it up and it reveals quite a bit of literature that this car comes with. There are a couple of interesting items in here. My very favorite is on page 90 and 91 when it goes through every single light bulb that is included in this car and what you should be changing it with. My favorite types of light bulbs, well, that would be special bayonet, of course. There are quite a few special bayonet bulbs in this car, although I must say I also love the double-ended festoon. Which is better, the special bayonet or the double-ended festoon? And next up, another unusual item included in all the literature, you have the dealership guide that tells you where all the Bentley dealerships are throughout the globe as of 1989 and 1990. Now this was a rough period for Bentley globally. They were not selling many cars. It was a tough sell compared to other kind of more modern, sportier luxury vehicles. So it was hard to get dealers to accept Bentley. A good example of that is in the United States of America dealer listing in Sacramento, the Bentley dealer is listed as Swift Dodge. So there was a Dodge Bentley dealer back in the day, but that was probably the only dealer Bentley could get in that area to sell their cars. And next up we move on to the back seat of the Turbo R. And the very first thing you notice when you open the door back here is this floor mat. It's had some years, but you can see it is a very thick, fluffy floor mat, nice for sticking your feet on instead of that crappy carpet that most cars have. In case the floor mat wasn't enough, you also have a footrest back here. You can stick this footrest wherever you want to kind of improve the positioning of your feet so they feel perfectly luxurious, just like everything else. And next up, another fantastic Bentley luxury feature back here is the tray tables. They come out from the backs of the front seats, you pull them down, and then you have this beautiful wood tray table that you can use to eat your picnic as you're being chauffeured along in the Bentley. And next up, another luxury touch back here is that the doors contain an ashtray and a cigarette lighter. And it's not just in one of the doors, it's in both of the doors. So each rear passenger has an equal chance to light their cigarette, or maybe more appropriately, their cigar. And next up, another luxury item in the back seat is the center armrest. You can see it's this leather piece. You pull it down and then you can use it as an armrest. But the interesting part is that when you pull the center armrest down, this like leather panel closes in behind it to make sure there's no empty space that doesn't have leather showing. You have leather behind leather in the center armrest, so it always remains beautiful. And another good example of Bentley making sure this car always remains beautiful is the seatbelt buckles. In every other car, the seatbelt buckles just kind of dangle around in the back seat. But in this car, you can actually buckle the seatbelt buckle to a dummy seatbelt in order to get it up off the seat and make it look nicer back here. Then when you were ready to buckle your actual seatbelt, you just unbuckled the buckle and buckled it into your real seatbelt. So there were extra dummy seatbelts hidden within the seats that pulled the buckle off the seat to to make things look nicer back here. And speaking of things looking nice back here, you will always look nice if you ride in the back of a Turbo R, because there are mirrors. If you look to the left or right of each seat, there is a mirror there that allows you to make sure you're looking your best. And in case you can't see yourself, there's a little switch next to the mirror that lets you turn on a light. One part of that switch turns on the overhead light, and the other part turns on the map light in case you want to read your map. Everything very luxurious for 1990. And next up, we move around to the back of the Turbo R, and I want to talk about the trunk. But first we have to cover just getting into the trunk. You come around back here and you see no latch, no keyhole, so how do you get in? Well, it turns out you go to the Bentley logo and you flip up the B, and then you can see hidden under there was a keyhole. You stick the key in, and then you pull on this little latch underneath the trunk lid, and then you pop open the trunk. So what's in the trunk of a Bentley Turbo R? Well, let's find out. You open it up and the answer is trophies. Lots of them. Now, before you go thinking this car has won a lot of awards, remember, this car was made in 1990, so it is a millennial. And these are participation trophies. No, I'm just kidding. This car has won a lot of awards. It's a really, really nice example of the Turbo R. So many of these are in rough shape, but this one isn't, and these trophies are a testament to its quality. Now, the other item worth noting in the trunk here is that it is quite large and quite flat. You don't have to deal with any wheel arches intruding on the trunk. You just have one giant, flat, rectangular space in here where you can put whatever you want. And one more interesting item worth noting with the trunk is that on the trunk lid itself, you have the brake lights. Take a look at this. You can see the brake lights are going on and they light up on the trunk lid. And indeed, the brake lights are fully working. This was all that would light up when you put on the brakes. Now, this would no longer be allowed. I've mentioned many times government regulations say that all brake lights have to be on a fixed piece of bodywork, but that was not the rule when this car was built, and so these brake lights are on the movable trunk. And next up, moving along to the outside of the Turbo R, I want to talk wheels. These wheels are so perfect for this car. The design, yes, but also the fact that they are chromed, which was so popular at the time. You would have looked so rich driving around in your white Bentley with your chrome wheels back when this car was new in the early 90s. Now, one interesting item with these wheels, you can see there are no visible lug nuts in these wheels, but next to the Bentley logo, you have a little circle with two dots in it. These cars came with a little key that you would stick into those two dots. Then you would turn it, you could pull off the little circle, then you could pull off a larger circle on the wheels and access the lug nuts in order to change your tire. The theory was that concealing the lug nuts made the car look just a little bit more beautiful. And next up, a couple of other notable items on the outside of this car. One is this chrome strip that goes down the hood to give the car a sense of class and luxury. You can see that there are a few inches between the end of this chrome strip and the Bentley logo, and instead of doing nothing about that, Bentley puts a smaller chrome strip here to continue the chrome line all the way to the Bentley logo. That is a nice piece of attention to detail. And finally, we move under the hood in the Turbo R. Now, to access the engine compartment, there's a little lever you pull in the driver footwell, like in a lot of cars. And then when you open up the hood, you can see it is front hinged, so it opens up backwards compared to most cars. And when you get under here, you can see this is a really cool look. I love this old school Bentley engine look. Now, this wasn't them trying to create an old school engine look. It was just a really old engine that they used for way too long. But I always loved how this engine looked, and I love the old Bentley font on the sides. One item that is worth noting in the engine bay, if you look closely at the labels, you can see one of them says Rolls-Royce on it. It's hard to imagine today, but back in the 80s and 90s and earlier, Rolls-Royce and Bentley were the same company before they split off and Volkswagen bought Bentley and BMW bought Rolls-Royce. In fact, there was a Rolls-Royce version of this car, the Silver Spirit and the Silver Spur. I reviewed one of those a couple of years ago, and I will link that video in the description below. But the Rolls-Royce was slow. The only way to get the turbo engine was to get the Bentley. and that is important. And so those are the quirks and features of the Bentley Turbo R. Now it's time to get it out on the road and see how it drives. All right, driving the Turbo R. Now, given the similarities in appearance, you may be wondering what exactly was the difference between the Rolls-Royce and the Bentley from this era. The brand, they didn't have enough money to create two vehicles, so they created one, and then they tried to distinguish them by saying that the Rolls-Royce was a car to be driven in, and the Bentley was a car if you wanted to drive yourself. And you still hear people say this. This was a marketing thing. Was it true? Well, the answer was initially no. The cars were pretty much identical. The original Bentley Mulsanne and the Rolls-Royce Silver Spur and Silver Spirit. It wasn't until they came out with the Turbo R that it actually mattered, because this was finally some distinction from Rolls-Royce. There was no way to get this turbo power plant if you got a Rolls. So how is it? Well, I'm gonna floor it here. It's certainly faster than the Rolls, there's no question about that, but this isn't exactly a fast car. Now, back in 1990, nothing was a fast car. A Camry did 0 to 60 in 10 seconds back then. So this was considered pretty quick and pretty boss back in the day. One notable item, though, is that Bentley and Rolls-Royce refused to publish horsepower numbers for these cars. Rolls-Royce called them sufficient. But I think that also spoke to the fact that they just weren't making that much power and they didn't want to be embarrassed. But it isn't what anybody would call fast today. And that wasn't really the point of this car anyway. It was developed as a big luxury cruiser. They just kind of threw more power in it to make it a little bit more sporty. And you can tell that when you go to steer. The car, there's a ton of body roll, there's a ton of float. It's not intended to be a performance or a sporty car in any way. It just happens to be a Rolls-Royce with more power and a little bit more presence thanks to the wheels and a few exterior Bentley touches. The Bentley was certainly the better looking between the two. In terms of the ride comfort, it is not as good as the Rolls-Royce, no question about it. This car is definitely stiffer, that was the intent, but it didn't really help much for the handling and the sportiness, so really you just got kind of a compromised car. But like I said, the Bentley was much better looking, the Bentley was a little bit faster, and certainly in today's world, the Bentley is the one to have. The Turbo Rs are the only ones that have any sort of value from this era. All the other Bentleys and Rolls from the 80s and 90s are worthless. These pull a little bit more money because they were kind of the pinnacle, and especially the later Turbo RT models are the very top of the top. And truthfully, if you're not scared to keep this thing running, this is a pretty cool way to spend $20,000, $25,000, $30,000. 15, 18, I don't know what they go for. It still has so much presence, but also you just don't see these anymore. There's nothing like it on the road. It's a special car. And I think it's one of the cheapest special cars that you could still roll up somewhere and have people be like, wow. Even though and most new pickup trucks cost twice what this does. And so that's the Bentley Turbo R. It's hard to believe that this was once the ultimate Bentley, but indeed it was the king of the hill 30 years ago. All I can say is I'm glad I live now and not 30 years ago. Anyway, now it's time to give the Turbo R a Doug score. Starting with the weekend categories and styling, the Turbo R looks nice, I like the appearance, but very 1980s, and it gets a 5 out of 10. Acceleration did 0 to 60 in the high 6-second range, and it gets a 2 out of 10. Handling is very average, not good by modern standards, and it gets a 3 out of 10. Fun factor is okay, it's not very fast or very sharp, most of the fun comes from driving a Bentley, and it gets a 4 out of 10. Cool factor is about average, it's cool, but not excessively so, and it gets a 5 out of 10 for a total weekend score of 19 out of 50. Next up are the daily categories and features. It's not especially well equipped by today's standards, and it gets a 3 out of 10. Comfort is excellent, though not quite as good as the Rolls-Royce from this era, and it gets a 9 out of 10. Quality is fine, the interior has nice materials, but reliability will surely be troublesome, and it gets a 6 out of 10. Practicality is average for a car like this, and it gets a 5 out of 10. Finally, value, and these are surprisingly cheap for what they offer, but they're also pricey to own. It gets a 6 out of 10 for a total daily score of 29 out of 50. Added up, and the Doug score is 48 out of 100, which places it here against other 1980s and early 90s luxury cars I've reviewed. The Turbo R finishes ahead of the Rolls-Royce Silver Spirit, mainly due to a higher weekend score, but it can't beat out the Aston Martin Lagonda, the quirky 1980s sedan champion.